all of the people who are not able to make it today. So hello, if you're watching this online. We just did a few introductions. We checked in on the website, which if you're here, I'm assuming you've kind of seen our website a little bit. The first thing I want to do is I want to review a little bit of material from the last couple classes, especially for the people who haven't seen them. These first couple of things are basically just my general tips on the cars section. So basically the first one is if you have trouble with reading comprehension, the best thing that you can do is you can read a book every single day. It can be any kind of book that you like. You can read Game of Thrones if you really want. You can read, I don't know, Harry Potter maybe. That's what you guys prefer. But the number one way to increase your reading comprehension skills is to read a book. If you are not able to actually understand most of the passages on the cars section, then you definitely need to be reading a book for at least 20 to 30 minutes a day. I know some of y'all who are testing in the next couple weeks or so, you're telling me, no, there's no way, I'm way too busy, I can never do that. But I do promise you, it will help you out. This is more of a long-term kind of thing, but I think it'll help everybody out if they just read a book every day. That's why I have that reading list up there on the website, just in case you guys want some inspiration or recommendations or whatever it is. The other thing I want to mention about the cars section is that the cars section is all about the author's opinion. It is all about what is in the passage and what you can get from the passage. Whereas in the other sections, even when you see a passage, most of the information that you need to answer the questions needs to be up here. It needs to be information that you already have. The cars section is not like that, and not at all. The cars section does not care about what is up here in your head. The cars section only cares about what is in the passage. It only cares about the author's opinion. The author's opinion will always be greater than our opinion. So it's tough for me to tell you guys this, but what we think, or what I think, or what you think really doesn't matter on the cars section. It's all about what does the author think. I'll show you all some examples of questions like that as we go along, but the main idea is the questions are always going to ask us, what is the author's main idea? What is the author's argument? What does the author think about this? What would the author say about that? Something like that. It was never going to ask us about our opinion. That's kind of what they mean by critical analysis. The CA in cars is critical analysis. We're analyzing the text for the author's opinion. We're not doing any thinking. This is not a critical thinking section per se. It doesn't mean you should just turn your brain off and just blindly pick something. But more than what we think, we need to think about what does the author think. There's two main approaches to timing methods on the car section. Let's see, we'll call this methods. There's two main timing methods we can use on the car section. One is the one that most people like to do when they first open up the car section for the first time. And that is to basically spend a couple minutes fully reading and comprehending the passage at the beginning. This timing strategy actually only works out if you can read and understand the passage in 5 minutes. If you can't read and understand the passage in 5 minutes, you're actually better off using method 2, which I'm going to talk about in a second here. I do mention this one because a lot of people love to do this. Even when I do one-on-one sessions with people, I'm trying to get them to use method 2. They're like, no, I've always used method 1. I'm just going to stick with method 1. And for some people that does work. It tends to work best for people who are naturally strong readers, just starting off. For most students, however, this is not efficient. Most students cannot finish the passage in 5 minutes. For most students, it takes something more like 7 or 8 minutes to just read the passage. And even if they do, they don't fully understand the passage in that 5 minutes, which kind of defeats the purpose as well. Method number 2 is what we call the BLAST method, or the one that I really focus on for class purposes. What this basically means is that we're going to skim the passage in 3 minutes, and we're going to write down quick summaries of each paragraph, which are like the blast. It's like a rocket blasting off. We're trying to go real fast. That's going to leave you about 1 minute per question and about 4 minutes of review time, or 9 on the COVID edition. If you don't want to take review time, some people tell me that they don't like to take review time because they're concerned they'll change the right answers to the wrong answers. Then you can get away with doing a little over 3 minutes. Just know that the way I have this set up, the one that I published on the website, it is designed to give you roughly a minute to review each passage at the end of the day. If you don't want to use that time, then you can afford to take a little bit more time reading the passage the first time around. How to write a blast, just a quick summary of how to write a blast. I hope most of y'all have seen the videos online about this, so I'm not going to stress this point too much today. The first thing is we're going to identify a main idea or key point from the first paragraph that's generally going to be something to do with the author's opinion. We're going to look for repetitions or synonyms of that main idea in other paragraphs. And if all else fails, we have a little backup plan. If we read a paragraph and we're like, I have no idea what's going on here, we're just going to read the first and last sentence. And we're going to try and get at least a summary or a main gist from that first and last sentence. So during class 2, we talked a lot, that was mostly class 1 stuff. During class 2, we talked a lot about question types. I'm going to kind of speed through these a little bit today just because it's not the emphasis today. The first question type is what we call understanding the basic components of the text. These are generally questions that have to do with the central argument, overarching theme, main idea. They phrase it differently sometimes, but it's generally speaking, these are broad answers, broad questions, broad answers, and we can usually get this information just straight up off of our blast. These are usually not questions. Sometimes the text can help you, but usually it will be something that the blast will help you out with the most sometimes. And skill 2B or 1B is what they call inferring meaning from rhetorical devices, word choice, and text structure. These questions will generally lead with something along the lines of what is the function of the phrase or word X? What did the author mean by this word? Another frequent one that I've seen a couple times is what can be inferred from the author's discussion of blank. That's another common one right there that falls under this type. These are actually always questions that you want to go back to the text for. If you have something like the function of the phrase this, you want to go back and find that phrase, at least read that sentence itself, so that you have a good perspective of what is right there in the section. One of the really classic traps that they love to hit you with on these questions is they'll give you something that is the main idea as an answer choice. The main idea as an answer choice. It will usually not be this one. That will usually be there to distract you. Because the phrasing of this question, what is the function of this word? What does the author mean by this? It's not asking you for the main idea. It's asking you for what is that sentence? What is that phrase? What does that word mean? And that's something we have to keep in mind. Skill 2 is what we call reasoning within the text. These are usually kind of related to the main idea, but they're more high-level questions. You got to use your brain a little bit to take a step past the main idea for these questions. A frequent one that's asked is which of the following is an assumption the author makes? And what we're looking for there is something that's not explicitly stated, but it's a pretty reasonable conclusion from what's stated. The answer will usually not be the main idea itself. It will be something that's maybe one step away from the main idea. Something that we have to take the main idea and then think just a little bit more about the main idea, and we should be able to answer these questions. You do need to know the main idea. If you don't know the main idea, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble here. But the answer is not the main idea itself. That's actually a frequent trap on these questions. Skill 3A, applying or extrapolating ideas from the passage to new context. These are generally not questions that have direct text evidence. You're going to have a pretty hard time finding direct text evidence for these things. What we want to do is apply the main idea to a new concept. We want to look for the author's opinion about whatever the question's asking, and we want to have an idea of what we're looking for before we even look at the choices. These are the classic hypothetical questions. We saw quite a few examples of this over the course of our first couple classes, but generally speaking, what we want to do in answering these questions is we first want to frame an answer in our heads. We want to know what we're looking for before we even dive into the answer choices. If you don't do that, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get very confused by the answer choices themselves if you don't know what you're looking for. If you don't feel comfortable framing an answer in your head, go back to the text. Go back to the text sometimes when I'm typing and talking at the same time, it's hard for me to keep track. But if you don't feel comfortable, if you don't know off the top of your head how you would answer that question, then go back to the text and try and create an answer in your head before you look at the choices. That'll help you out immeasurably in these questions. And then go to the answer choices themselves. We also have skill 3B, which is what we call assessing the impact of new factors, information, or conditions to ideas from the passage. These questions traditionally kind of lead you off with the word suppose, but that's not always the case. Sometimes they'll change up the wording a little bit for you just to confuse you. They love to do that. Suppose that X is true, what would the author say about it? Suppose that X is true, what would it strengthen or weaken the author's argument? Another example. This is actually a question type that a lot of people have asked me about during one-on-one sessions, during other things. But we always want to make sure that we know that when we look at strengthened or weakened questions, what we mean by strengthened is another example for the author's point. When the author gave his opinion, more than likely he gave a couple examples at least to kind of back up his opinion. If it's another example just like that, it's always going to strengthen the argument. Whereas if we have, for a weakened, we're looking for an alternate explanation. So one of the classic examples was something that I'm going to talk about, something I think we talked about in the last couple classes is, so let's say the author is saying something about fake news regarding vaccinations. Regarding vaccinations, like vaccines cause autism or whatever. And that is leading to declining vaccination rates. So what I mean by this is if I give another example of fake news leading to declining vaccination rates, that's going to strengthen my point. If I give for a weekend, if I give something else that might explain a declining vaccination rates, an alternate explanation for this, that is going to weaken this relationship right here, and that's going to weaken my author's point. And I know it doesn't make a ton of sense right now when I'm just saying it, but I'll show you guys some examples of that today as we keep on with our class. And what are we doing today? Well, hopefully you guys have seen a little bit about the BLAST technique and have applied it a little bit to the passages from the previous classes. We're today going to apply the BLAST technique to some more advanced passages. One tip that I'm going to give you guys is if you need to split up paragraphs, if you think a paragraph is just way too long and there's no way you're going to be able to read it, go ahead and just split it up. I'll show you guys how to do that in a second here. And we're also going to talk a little bit about trap answers. I'm not going to hone in on this point too much this class. We're going to emphasize it next week. But I do want to mention it a little bit. We're going to talk about trap answers just a little bit today. So that brings me to not this page. That brings me to this page right here. This is the CARS Week 3 material that we've been that you guys hopefully have pulled from the website prior to this class. Let's get rid of this. Okay. I do have a couple notes that I put in here. I don't think this is on the digital version that I put online, but a few things to remember as we do this. First of all, your paragraph probably looks like this. First thing is if you're really confused as to what the author's opinion is, then a good place to check on that is going to be the last sentence of the first paragraph. Maybe more than half the time, the author's opinion will be pretty well summarized in the last sentence or so of the first paragraph. As we read these paragraphs, don't forget your backup plan. If you're really lost on what the paragraph is talking about, don't be afraid to just read the first and last sentence. That's totally okay. It's not bad in any way to read the first and last sentence and move on. If that's actually much more time efficient than trying to skim through and read every single word of these paragraphs. I do want to mention what happens. I picked this paragraph for a reason. What happens if we run into a paragraph like this that is absolutely massive and we have no idea how to get through this paragraph? Well, what we're going to do in this case is we're going to split this up. On the real test, we are not going to have the luxury of being able to just hit enter like that and split up the paragraph. We're going to have to be a little bit more creative. In most cases, yes. Unless you have a ridiculously long first paragraph, I do recommend that you read the entire first paragraph. Sometimes if the first paragraph looked more like this, then I might not, just because it's too long for me. But if we have a reasonably sized first paragraph, then I'm going to go ahead and read all of it. And we're going to look for some keywords or author's opinions or something like that that's going to help us skim the rest of it. So we have this really long paragraph. And how are we going to split it up? What we're going to do is we're going to find a decent halfway point, maybe around here. And we're going to look for a sentence that ends here. Here's a sentence that ends. So we can split it up right here. On the real test, all you're going to be able to do is make a little highlight mark right there. But what we're going to do is, for our blasting purposes, we're going to treat this as paragraph 1. We're going to treat this as paragraph 2. We're going to treat this as paragraph 3. We're going to treat this as a completely different paragraph, just to make life a little easier for ourselves. So we don't have to try and skim this entire thing and write a summary of this entire thing. We can always just split up the paragraphs a little bit. And obviously this is paragraph 4 down here. So, oops, I already have my blast down there. I'm gonna get rid of that while y'all are working. But what I'd like you guys to do is I got rid of my timer. We can use a timer. We can use this timer right here. I'm gonna go ahead and give you guys 4 minutes. This is, for some of y'all, maybe the first time practicing the blast skill, so I'll give you a little bit longer than you would have. I'll give you 4 minutes, and I'd like you to write a blast for this first passage. Again, you should have entries for P1, P2, P3, and P4, because we are considering this to be paragraph 2. We are considering this to be paragraph 3, and obviously that makes this paragraph 4. So make sure you should not have 3 entries in your blast. If you do, you're doing it wrong. You should have 4. You should have 4 little summaries for your blast. I'm going to go ahead and let y'all get started on that. You have 4 minutes. Please get started. Okay, guys. Um, that is time. That is 4 minutes. Actually, before I move on, just because I just got an email about this, I don't know if y'all would be interested. But if any of y'all are on the fee assistance program, I know that probably applies to some of you. UWorld actually offers a discount for fee assistance program students. If you're interested in that, shoot me an email because it's like way cheaper with fee assistance program. It's something like $10 a month with fee assistance. So if you're interested in that, I'm just reminding you because I just got this email about it right now. But go ahead and shoot me an email. I can definitely forward you this information about getting that discount on UWorld. Let's get rid of that. Okay. So what we just did is we did a blast of this first paragraph. I do want to tell y'all a little bit about timing on this real quick before we move on. What I just gave you guys right there was 4 minutes for the blast. If you do that times 8 passages on the COVID edition of the test, 4 minutes per blast times 8 passages, that'll give you 32 minutes spent blasting things. There are 48 questions on the test, on the COVID edition at least. There's 53, I want to say, on the full length, times 1 minute per question, which is a pretty average time spent per question. That'll give you 48 minutes. And that gives you a total of 81 minutes, of 80 minutes, excuse me, that you spent doing the test. Does anyone happen to know what the maximum time is on the car section in the COVID edition?
81.
81 minutes. So theoretically, super theoretically, if you were willing to cut it really close to the end, you could take 4 minutes per blast. I personally advise students to try and do it a little bit faster than that. At least shoot for 3 minutes and 30, because that way you're not cutting it so close to the end. And if you run into like some weird passage that's really tough or something like that, you're not freaking out and rushing yourself. But theoretically, yeah, you could do 4 minutes of blast. You just cut it super close. So that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at this first paragraph. What did y'all put as a blast for the first paragraph for P1?
Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was a failure and that people didn't like unfamiliarity in form. Oh, I was totally reading a different passage.
Yeah, you were reading passage 2.
I'm so sorry.
That's totally okay. We will help you out. We will hopefully give you the blast of passage 1, and you can tell us whether you can kind of follow along based just on people's blasts, okay?
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. You are way ahead of us. You did passage 2. That's okay. Could someone tell me what the blast for paragraph 1 of passage 1 is?
I just said Aries' novel about the Tarapi people.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I said.
Cool, yeah. Toripi, I believe that's how you say it. I could be totally wrong. Could be butchering these people's names. But yeah, so what we have right here is they kind of let us off. They're talking about this novel, The Crocodile. It is about this guy, Hoiri, who is a member of the Taripi tribe. They live in Papua. They're kind of a tribal people, very traditional tribal people. One day, they get conquered by the Australian colonial rule. That's something that stood out to a few people, not saying that it had to for you. And it seems that this novel basically talks a lot about the Taripi people, gives encyclopedic information about commerce, education, history, blah, 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 thick description of Taripi customs and practices, blah, 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 blah. So what I'm really getting out of that is this is Aries' novel. It's about the Taripi people. A lot of people said something about the Australian colonial rule. A lot of people mentioned just the customs, practices of the Taripi people. Any of those work. It's obviously not a very strict thing. It is a summary that works for you. So I'll let you guys do whatever summary you want, but I did give you guys quite a few options right over there of things you could have put as summary. That being said, let's go over to paragraph 2. And in the interest of my personal sanity for right now, we'll go ahead and we will make this a separate paragraph. What did you guys put as a blast for paragraph 2?
So for Blast 2, I mentioned that the author gives his first opinion that the narratives are more than just traditions. They talk about the effects of the colonization.
Right, very nice. The narrative has both. Actually, it has, they're talking about I think a first arc and a second arc. It does give some traditions. The narrative has traditions and some stuff about colonial rule. Traditions, and we can do a little highlighting as well in here. If we want to stick really close to what we're doing, we can say that it gives we can just do the first and last sentence because I want to prove to y'all the point of you can get away with doing just the first and last sentence. You actually get pretty far with it. So first of all, they tell us that Aries' novel is much more than a fictionalized anthropological account of Taripi life. It also, the second arc of the book, includes some stuff about the hardships endured by the Papuans under the Australian colonial government. So yeah, basically, we're basically saying that the narrative of the story has both some stuff about the traditional Taripi people and some stuff about this colonial rule. Awesome. And what about paragraph 3? What did y'all think?
I said, hardships endured by the tribals mostly from the colonial rule, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So once again, I am kind of focusing on the first and last sentence thing today, but a lot of y'all probably skimmed and kind of read what was up in here. We'll look at first sentence, last sentence. Okay, so up here, we're reading something about the Taripi were exploited as workers for these guys, the Kiops. They were trying to civilize their people. They kind of suppressed the tradition of the Taripi people. So we could sum that up as hardships faced by Taripis under colonial rule. I actually had no idea prior to reading this passage that Australia colonized. That's something I learned. But either way. And what about this last paragraph? What did we get out of the last paragraph? Anyone? I'm going to start calling on people who haven't spoken yet. Let's see. Shioma? What did you say was just a kind of a quick summary of this last paragraph here? Or Christine, anyone?
Yeah, I said also, so this was something added, money economy canceled out traditional practices and worsened colonialism.
Yeah, so money economy kind of messed with their traditions. And you said it worsened colonialism?
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, these guys are kind of getting screwed on both ends. There is the actual colonial people. I think they're talking about these government officers or something who are actively kind of trying to hurt them. And there's also this economic thing. Australian colonial laws are not the only authority Hoiri encounters. The money economy erodes traditional trading and labor practices and deepens colonial authority. Okay, cool. So at this point, one thing I like to do, if you're still feeling a little confused, if you felt you understood the passage pretty well, then you can skip this step. But one thing I like to do for students who got through all that and still feel like they have no idea what's going on is let's kind of take a look at our blast one more time. So we're talking about this Aries novel. It's about the Taripi people, something about Australian colonial rule and the practices of those people. We said that the book itself has both some stuff about their traditions and some stuff about colonial rule. It seems actually like the passage itself really focuses on the hardships faced by the Taripi under colonial rule. And there's also this bit about how the money economy kind of adds to that or perpetuates that. It messes with their traditions and it worsens this effect of colonialism on them. So let's go ahead and dive into the questions. I have gone ahead and put some notes into these questions, which y'all probably don't have on your end. But the first one is, of the following premises, which best represents an example most similar to what the author probably means by the phrase literary tension in paragraph 2? Okay, so we have a question that specifically referenced us to this thing, literary tension in paragraph 2. So let's go ahead and we'll jump back and we'll try and find what we're talking about as a literary tension. Actually, on your end, both of these are paragraph 2. So we'll have to look for some stuff. We'll do a quick skim. And
Third para, yeah.
yeah, so it's right here. The literary tension produced by these narrative arcs constitutes the novel's profound critique of the effects of colonial rule. Okay, so what I like to do when the question specifically references me to a phrase or a word or whatever is I go ahead and I highlight this whole sentence. I kind of read up on the sentence. Sometimes you'll be able to answer the question just based on the sentence, the literary tension, blah, blah, blah. However, in this case, that's not necessarily true. In this case, this sentence basically references us to these two narrative arcs. And you're probably asking yourself, if you just skimmed really fast and you don't know what these two narrative arcs are, maybe at this point you want to brush up a little bit. You want to figure out what are these two narrative arcs we're really talking about. So we can do a little bit of reading. We can read back a little bit. And we probably see that here's something about the first arc. The first arc revolves around the mysterious death of Hoiri's young wife. She got killed by a crocodile. And it seems to involve something about these sorcerers from a neighboring tribe. Okay, so there's the first arc right there. That kind of is one of these traditional stories, you might call it, of the Taripi people. And the second arc really revolves around this thing, the hardships endured by the Papuans under the Australian colonial government. So what he's saying is that when we do hypothetical questions like this, we want to form a pretty solid idea of what we're looking for prior to looking at the answer choices. Because the answer choices are very confusing, I guarantee you that. When we do these hypothetical questions, we want to have a solid idea of what the author means by literary tension. And that's just this thing that we just said. There's two arcs, the Taripi thing and the colonial thing. And the author is focusing on the tension between those two arcs, and that really drives forward his story. So let's go ahead and we'll look for what is going on here. Revisit ancient spice trade routes that resulted in cross-cultural cuisine. Now you have a little spoiler there. This doesn't seem too related to the author's main point. I could kind of see something about ancient spice trade routes being related to the traditional Taripi thing. But then again, we are looking for two different cultures. When we say literary tension, we're talking about something that involves two different cultures and the tension between those two cultures. So this is kind of out. It doesn't seem that related, and it's also just, again, about one culture or one ancient spice trading route. Capture the experience of a teenage girl being adopted by parents of a different culture. So we like this one because there is actually some tension there. There is the girl's traditional values or whatever it is from her old culture, and now she's being introduced to a new culture, and there's some tension there. If you didn't have my little spoiler down here, you might still be a little lost. So we'll go ahead and we can kind of see how this relates to what we're talking about, but we'll read the next answer choice. Explores the consequences of a religious conflict between neighboring cultures. Well, once again, this is kind of reminding me of that Taripi thing, where he's talking about the sorcerer from another village and has somehow made a crocodile eat this guy's wife. And so that doesn't really have to do with two different cultures that have tension with each other. And it also, we don't have much of this religious conflict aspect in our passage that we just read, go ahead and take that one out. Illuminates the social experience of an ethnic minority under authoritarian rule. And here's another example of a trap answer, because if you were just looking for the main idea of the story, the main idea of the story is something about how these Taripi people really got screwed over by the Australian colonial rule. And you might be able to connect that Taripi thing to the social experience of a minority under authoritarian rule. And I definitely see that connection. This arc about the colonial people very well relates to this thing. But we're not looking for something about the colonial rule. We're looking for something that incorporates both this traditional aspect and the colonial aspect. That's why the best answer is actually this guy right here, answer choice B. We're looking for something about two different cultures having tension with each other. Okay, so let's go to the next one. Which of the following assertions best captures a key idea in the passage? Vincent Airy's novel, The Crocodile, illustrates how Australian colonialism in Papua. So this is a main idea, key idea question. They call it a key idea right here. It's a little rephrasing, but the same thing. We're looking for the main idea. And so one thing that we can do is we can kind of look at these and we can kind of try and figure out which one of these matches the main idea. So the first one is reinvigorate local cultures by encouraging native and communal family values. I'm not liking this one too much because it says reinvigorate local cultures. And it seemed that our passage was mainly focused on how the colonial stuff hurt the local culture of the Taripi people. We'll go ahead and take this one out. Doesn't seem to be the main idea at all. It seems to be kind of opposite the main idea, really. Asserted control through government and religious authority. Now, I kind of like this one because I am understanding where they're coming from right there. They're saying that, you know, the Australian and the colonial people have asserted authority onto our friends at the Taripi tribe through both the government, and there was some little mention of the religious stuff somewhere up in here. He said something about how his father's traditions, his father's church was also stopping him from pursuing his traditional values. So I am kind of liking this answer choice, but I'll go ahead and read the other ones. Established a strong national identity through a unified educational system. Now, I didn't read anything about either of those. I didn't read about an educational system. I didn't read about a national identity. Go ahead and take that out. Conquered Papua through a divide and rule colonial stratagem. Now, I think this is a little bit of a trap answer. You might think that that's true. I personally don't know much about the Taripi people or the Papua colonialism thing. It's very likely that historically speaking, that is true. Maybe they did divide and rule these people. But we never really discussed how Papua was colonized in the passage. We discussed the effects of colonization, but we did not discuss how the Australians really took over in Papua. So I'm going to go ahead and take that one out. And we're left with our answer that we kind of liked at the beginning. This thing right here. We have now the next question. Suppose, so here's a keyword, suppose, that currently the majority of the population in modern Papua still identify with particular clans, observe tribal laws, and earn livelihoods from subsistence-based agriculture. Based on the passage, the author of The Crocodile would probably view these realities as, okay, so the first thing is we have a suppose question. They've given us new information. This information was never provided actually in the passage itself. But the first thing that we can do is we can think about, we see that these answer choices are focused on negative or positive things. So we can think about whether this guy, Airy, the author of The Crocodile, would he like this or would he not like this? And so what I'm thinking is that Vincent Airy seemed to be pretty upset that the Australian colonial rule was hurting the traditional Papuan people. So I think that Vincent Airy would kind of like that the majority of the people in modern Papua are still vibing with their traditional values. They're still keeping up those traditional values. I would think that he sees that as a pretty positive thing. So right off the bat, I'm looking at something that's positive. Right here, I'm looking for something that's positive. So let's see what we can do there. Just working off the concept that's probably a positive thing. So first of all, we have a sign that Papua has balanced both modern and traditional values. Well, it seems like a majority of these people in Papua are still on the traditional values. So I don't see much about balancing modern and traditional right here. A sign that Papua was able to resist social disintegration under colonial rule. Now, I kind of like this one. If you read a little bit more of the passage than I did, he does say something or another about social disintegration. He does reference those exact words somewhere or another in here. I'm not finding it right now. But either way, he does say that what he's really concerned about is social disintegration. These traditional values are disintegrating or disappearing because of the colonial rule's effect on them. So he would really like that the Papuans are resisting this. So that is definitely our correct answer. We did narrow out 2 of the answer choices based solely on our perception of the author's opinion. That was a good start. And between these 2 answer choices, ultimately, I did like this one more. So that's a good thing. There's a good one. So here's another question. Which of the following is not mentioned in the passage as having a negative effect on Papuan people? So one thing I might notice right off the bat is, first of all, this is a not question, which is not mentioned, and not mentioned as having a negative effect. So I've set myself up with kind of a double negative sort of deal here, in which I'm asking which of the following is not a negative effect. So another way to rephrase that question, if I want to frame it a little bit without those negatives in my head, is which of the following has a positive effect on the Papuan people, just for a little bit of simplicity and mental sanity for myself there. So the first thing is Kiop justice, and I still have my notes there. We could look back and we could see that these Kiops were these government officers, colonial Australian government officers. And that's definitely a negative thing. Our author does not like the colonial government officers. We'll go ahead and take that out. Labor practices. Well, labor practices is a little bit of an odd thing. I'm having trouble immediately tying whether that's positive or negative, though I did see something down here about how the money economy erodes traditional trading and labor practices and deepens colonial authority. So I'm leaning toward negative on that, but I'm not 100% sure. We'll go ahead and leave that for now. Traditional customs. Well, traditional customs are definitely a positive thing for our author. He likes traditional customs. So we'll go ahead and say that that's positive for right now. Imported goods is definitely also negative. Imported goods kind of leads into this thing he was saying about the money economy. The money economy, if you read a little bit more into this paragraph, basically he's talking about the white man's commodity culture. He's talking about something about clothing and sales and so on, buying from the Australians. But those are definitely framed as negative things. The one thing that strikes me as unanimously positive is traditional customs. Our author is definitely a big fan of traditional customs. So we'll go ahead and pick that as our answer. It's definitely a good thing, or a positive thing. The author mentions Hoyri's experiences with the crocodile in paragraph 2, most likely in order to support which point? Well, so we're starting off Hoyri's experiences with the crocodile. Now, I didn't read much about Hoyri's experiences with the crocodile, but they've given me a specific reference point, something about Hoyri and the crocodile. So before we confuse ourselves with the answer choice, let's go back and let's read a little bit about this. And so that's basically this bit right here when we're talking about the first arc of the story. Revolves around the mysterious death of Hoyri's young wife, Mituro, presumed to be taken and killed by the eponymous crocodile, and involves the complex actions and motivations of sorcerers, I guess they call them Masiri men, thought to be tribesmen from a neighboring clan. And one point I want to make right here is that there is nothing about colonialism in this story. If I was looking for the main idea, yeah, the main idea has to do with colonialism. this specific maybe 2 sentences or so right here have nothing to do with colonialism. This is a completely different story. This is something that was happening in the Taripi village or the Taripi clan or whatever prior to any of this colonialism stuff. This seems to be kind of like a religious or mystical or folklore kind of story of the Taripi people. It does not have much to do with colonialism. So let's take a look at these things. Taripi is caught, Hoiri is caught in the clash between 2 cultural universes that have competing values. Now I can kind of see this one because it's coming again back to our idea of like literary tension, the tension between the Taripi values and the colonial values. I was looking for something a little bit closer to the Taripi side of things, but I'll go ahead and keep this answer for right now, just because I can see the connection. Papuan sovereignty can be imagined and asserted against white rule. Well, right there, it's not really talking about fighting back against the white people. It seems to basically be focusing on this conflict in the Taripi world itself. So I'll go ahead and take that one out. The ecosystem in which the Taripi people lived was dangerous. This is actually probably the most commonly picked trap answer, just because they are talking about a crocodile, but it doesn't seem to be like it's a natural thing that's going on. It seems to be that these sorcerers or whoever have kind of manipulated the situation and manipulated this crocodile to go attack his wife. I wouldn't exactly call that the ecosystem per se. I don't think ecosystem is the right word to depict what's going on right there. Resisting colonial cultural hegemony. If you don't know what hegemony is, I wrote a little definition. It means kind of dominance right there. And political power is futile. Once again, that's reminding me of this answer choice B, where we're talking about fighting back against the Australians, resisting them is futile, something along those lines. And again, I don't think this specific area right here has anything to do with resisting the white influence. I think this is definitely, though it's not a perfect answer, if you gave me this question and you asked me without any answer choices to tell you what's the point of that story about the crocodile, I probably wouldn't have come up with something like this, but it is definitely the best answer because we have this idea of the Taripi cultural universe. And as he goes on to say right after that, he's talking about this colonial cultural thing that's going on and still kind of hurting the Taripi people. So we'll go ahead and pick this one for right now. That is definitely the right answer. And according to the passage, which of the following best describes the main goal of the crocodile? So number one, again, this is a broad question. We're talking about the main goal or the main idea of this book, The Crocodile. To catalog Taripi customs and practices in the Gulf District of Papua. Now, I guess I could kind of see this one. They do talk a little bit about the Taripi customs and practices. They said right up here, much of the narrative is devoted to providing the reader with a thick description of Taripi customs and practices. However, the real focus of this passage really seems to be on this colonial stuff versus just talking about what the Taripi people were like before the colonial stuff. So I'm not going to go ahead and cross that answer out right now. I can kind of see the connection there, but I do want something that's more focused on the colonial aspect of it. Demonstrate the encroachment of a colonial system on the Taripi way of life. Now, I do like this one because we are talking about the colonial stuff and we're talking about how it's kind of hurting the Taripi people. I do like this answer choice. I'll go ahead and read the other one. Protest the exploitative and racist behavior of the Keops. Now, that is definitely mentioned. They do say something about the Keops over here, exploited as domestic workers, regularly patrol the interior to pacify and civilize the natives. They do mention some stuff about the Keops. However, I don't think that's the main goal or the main idea of this passage. I think saying that's the main goal is a little bit of a stretch. Show the difficulties faced by a newly decolonized sovereign government. There was literally nothing about that. That's completely a different point. We never talked about what happened to the Taripi people after the Australians left. Maybe in the actual book, maybe in the actual book, the crocodile that is mentioned, I don't really know. I've never read the book. But according to the passage, that's not really what the crocodile is about. I'm going to go ahead and cross that out. And between these two ones, this one is just talking about the Taripi customs and practices. This one is talking about colonial stuff and the Taripi stuff. So I do like this one better. I think that's a better answer. So cool. What we did is actually, I answered a vast majority of those questions based just on my blast. There were a few questions. Let's see, this one has specifically referenced me over to paragraph 2. This one has also referenced me over to paragraph 2. And so I went back and read on those things. But a majority of these questions, especially the main idea, the key idea, even the suppose question, questions like that, most of it I just got from my blast and my summary and my skimming. So what I'm really trying to demonstrate to y'all is really, you don't need to read this whole passage in order to answer most of these questions. Usually the questions that refer to a specific detail in the passage, they'll tell you where that detail is. This was a pretty detailed thing, Koiri's experiences with the crocodile, and they told me it's in paragraph 2. Even if I didn't read anything about this the very first time around, I could still go back to paragraph 2 and look at it. No problem. So what that brings us over to is this passage 2, this one about Walt Whitman. I know that Ariana already got a start on that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the amount of time that you would have on the real test to answer these questions. On the real test, there's 8 passages in 81 minutes, meaning that you get roughly 10 minutes and 10 seconds to answer each passage. I'm going to go ahead and give you all exactly that amount of time to do this. One thing I like to focus on is, just like we did up here, don't try and read every word of this passage. I did pick this passage for a reason. I picked this passage because if you try and read every word of this passage, I virtually guarantee you're going to be very confused. Unless you have some kind of very strong background in poetry or something like that, you're going to get lost very quickly in some of these big paragraphs, especially. The best way to approach this paragraph, I'll go ahead and tell you, is kind of going for a skimming method. So I'm going to give you all 10 minutes and 10 seconds on the clock, and we can go ahead and get started. Okay, guys, that's time. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna kind of discuss both the blast and the answer choices over there. How'd y'all feel on the time? Good, bad?
Surprisingly, I was left with extra time for the first time.
Extra time. Okay, cool. Were you using kind of like a skimming technique and writing blasts and all that?
Yeah, that's like my first time using it.
Cool.
And I had 4 minutes extra.
4 minutes extra.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's really good. Ariana, I hope you finished.
I was gonna say I never typically use the first and last sentence strategy, but I
Mhm.
don't know if it was just this passage, but it like actually helped a lot better than when I first did it, just skimming.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, I do recommend if you're lost, if you don't know what's going on in the paragraph, which is probably very true for a lot of these paragraphs where they're talking about like, I don't know, the rhythm or whatever of Walt Whitman's poetry. Just if you're reading something like that and you have no idea what's going on, just go for the first and last sentence. Um, when we talked about doing blasts in previous classes, we did talk a little bit about like identifying keywords. Like maybe I identified the crocodile, and I'm looking for the word I'm looking for the crocodile, the crocodile, the crocodile up in here somewhere. Maybe I identify Australian colonial rule as the keyword, and I'm looking for something about colonial rule, something like that up in these paragraphs. But if that fails you, just go ahead and read the first and last sentence. And honestly, you'll still probably do pretty decently on these. Um, it does take a little bit of experience to know when do you want to use the keywords, when do you feel so lost that you just want to read the first and last sentence and move on. But the point I was really trying to drive in today is that even if you have like this really goofy passage where all you're really doing is reading the first and last sentence, most of the time you'll still be okay. So in that vein, let's go ahead and let's take my blast out so y'all can't cheat. That was the blast I wrote last time. Put that here so we can look at it later. But, so as far as paragraph 1 goes, what y'all think? What was a good blast for paragraph 1?
He said no pattern, not different as it appears. That's what I said. Verse form, he never cared for those things. He rejected rhythm, stuff, some stuff like that.
Okay, was that paragraph 1 right here?
Yeah. He said.
I think that verse
Oh,
form
no. I'm
stuff is
reading
right.
from the second one. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. That's okay.
Sorry, he said people think they can identify excellence, but that's not true. That's not always true.
Not always true. Very good. And then paragraph 2. Repeat what you said about paragraph 2. Sorry.
I said author. I mean the poet. I don't remember the name, but I put a W. I usually use shortcuts. I don't write
We'll call
names.
them W.
Yeah. W had no pattern, didn't care for verse or rhythm. But after all, it's not as different as it first appears to be.
Exactly. Very good. Okay. And let's see. Does anyone have any thoughts on paragraph 3?
It was just his second point. So not successful because people were confused.
Yeah, not successful.
I just put equal.
Sorry, what was the last thing you just said there?
I just said because of confusion.
Yeah, because of confusion. Specifically, he's talking a little bit about this nature and art thing.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes on this whole tangent about these ancient Greek people who were saying something about nature and art. I didn't read too much of that because it seemed way too specific for me. But then he kind of comes back to his little nature and art thing down at the end here. And so I did put not successful, same stuff as P2. It was not familiar to people. And there was something about confusion between nature and art right there. So we put that there. And what about P4?
So I said that life is not equal to organized. So W doesn't separate art and nature.
Yeah. So this was coming back even more onto that nature versus art point. Doesn't separate nature and art. Life is not organized. Walt Whitman does not separate nature and art. And what about paragraph 5?
The use of I in quotes, not liked.
Yeah, so this was another thing that people didn't like. They said use of the word I. I think he said individualism, egoistic, things like that. But the real point of this is that Walt Whitman used the word I a lot, and that was one of the other things that people didn't like about him. And so another thing that you could have put, I personally did use the word I a lot, but some other people I know type something along the lines of individualistic. So maybe egoistic is another word they use, and leave that totally fine. Okay, so I do have some answers over here. I do have some little notes over here that might help us out. But the author quotes the views of other critics in order to support which claim about Whitman's poetry. So let's go ahead. And the first one is imagery was too inclusive. Now, when I was reading this, I kind of connected this to this idea of nature and art, but I wasn't exactly sure whether that meant it was inclusive per se. That seemed a little odd to me, so I kind of skipped over that for a little bit. And then we have this one that says it lacked patterned verse. Well, now this is actually a trap answer. I went ahead and wrote that right over here. And the reason it's a trap answer is because we said that a lot of people thought Walt Whitman had no pattern or verse or rhythm or whatever, but in reality, it was not as different as it appears. So if you look back, I'll go ahead and say that was a really hard question. A lot of people picked that answer choice, the thing about pattern verse. So it says something repelled readers, the verse form, the poetry of Walt Whitman had no apparent pattern. But if you actually take a look at the very end, a lot of the critics argued that the verse form in Leaves of Grass is not as unorthodox as it appears. It's not as weird as it appears. That's why this is not a great answer. It is a trap answer. I originally looked at the percentages on this one. I think something like 50% of people or so picked this answer choice right here. Most people pick that. It is a bit of a trap answer because if you're just looking at this first sentence right over here, you might easily get that. There was no apparent pattern. There was no apparent pattern to Whitman's verse. However, he kind of contradicts himself. He kind of contradicts what he's saying at the very end. All of these guys he's talking about at the end, I didn't read much of their opinions, but the point is, we kind of summarized, all of them argue that the verse form in Leaves of Grass is not as unorthodox as it appears. So, whereas the poetry looked like it lacked pattern verse, in reality it is not as much once you kind of analyze it a little bit. Here's this thing, that it distorted nature. Again, I was kind of thinking back to that thing about nature versus art. However, distorted nature didn't exactly seem like the right answer there. What did he say? Something about W does not separate nature and art. I don't think distorted is exactly the right word for that. So we'll go ahead and take that one out. That it was publicly repudiated. I did give a hint in the first class that if you don't know the word, don't pick that answer choice. Only pick the words that you know what it means. If you don't know what repudiated means, it does actually mean something along the lines of hated. But publicly repudiated is not exactly true. The reason why it's not true is because in the very first paragraph, we said that the first time Leaves of Grass was published, people did not like it. People, the readers in general, did not like it. And I guess it is a little bit of a stretch to say hated. But also, the literary critics loved Whitman. The literary critics loved Whitman. And in this answer, we are looking for the views of the critics. We're not looking for the views of people in general. We might be able to say hated it, but the critics themselves liked Whitman. And even though I actually was not 100% clear on what this answer is exactly meaning, when they say the imagery was too inclusive, it is definitely the right answer. I'm going to be honest, I cannot justify exactly why that's the right answer because I'm still not 100% clear on what it means by imagery was too inclusive. The best thing I can do is kind of lead you to this stuff about nature versus art. He was kind of inclusive of both nature and art, I guess is the best way to describe that. But it's definitely the right answer, even though I didn't really understand what it meant the first time around. But by process of elimination, I have gotten that as my answer. In the discussion of the first unsuccessful publication of Leaves of Grass, so basically the first time around, not talking about the professors and the critics and all, which of the following is not mentioned as a reason for the book's initial failure? And again, sometimes they like to trick you with these not questions. I kind of refer to these questions as questions in the negative, or I call it the negative frame, actually. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next class. But these questions are framed in the negative in the sense that they're asking you which of these is not a reason for the book's initial failure. Which of these is not a reason that people hated the books? And we did talk about quite a few reasons why people hated the books up in here. There was a thing about the pattern and the verse or whatever. There's this thing about nature versus art. And there's this thing about using the word I being individualistic, egoistic, whatever you want to call it. So we're looking for something that is not one of those things. That's a good thing to keep in mind. Lack of structure. Well, we could definitely say lack of structure in terms of this having no pattern, his verse or whatever. That is a reason why people initially didn't like it. We can argue a little bit about whether that was true or not, whether their complaints were true, but that is a reason that people gave for why they didn't like it. Imagery. We did talk a little bit about imagery in terms of the nature versus art thing. And so we'll go ahead and take that out. We're looking for something that's not mentioned. Offensive content. Well, I didn't read much about that. It was definitely not mentioned. We didn't say that, Whitman uses the F word all the time or anything like that. Egoism, yeah, I guess I can see egoism. This use of the word I, individualistic, uses the word egoistic actually in the passage itself. But egoism is something that's definitely mentioned up in the passage. We'll go ahead and take that one out. And we're left with this thing about offensive content. Information in the passage suggests that Whitman's poetry in Leaves of Grass was most likely characterized by. So this is they kind of phrase this in a weird way, but it is a main idea question. What Whitman's poetry is most likely characterized by? What is a main idea or a theme or a key something in Walt Whitman's poetry? So let's go ahead and we'll look for the answer. The first one, individual political autonomy. That's kind of weird. I didn't see anything about political autonomy in this passage. We're going to take that one out. Jumbled and disordered natural imagery. Now I can see that one. I can see that one for sure. Because we were talking about that whole blurring the line between nature and art kind of deal. So we'll go ahead and keep that one for now. Unusual grammatical structure. Now, I didn't read too much about grammatical structure. We did talk about verse a little bit. We talked about rhythm. I didn't read about grammatical structure. So I don't like this answer choice, but I suppose if I was just left with this at the very end, I might consider it. So we'll go ahead and leave that. Again, I didn't even read much of the passage. I read like maybe half of it or so, something like that. So I guess I can't take that one out offhand. Overly simplistic language. I didn't read about simplistic language. I didn't read something like Whitman uses small words, Whitman doesn't use fancy terms. I didn't read much about simplistic language. I'll go ahead and take that out. I do think the best answer is definitely this thing about natural imagery. We read quite a lot about nature versus art. And again, we are looking for something that's broad. It's very possible that it's some detail or a small sentence somewhere or another. He mentioned something about grammatical structure. Again, we didn't read the whole passage, so we really, I guess we can't rule that out. But again, we're looking for kind of a main idea about Whitman's poetry. And so even if this was mentioned as a small detail somewhere, it's definitely not the main idea. This is definitely a better characterization of the main idea. And so we'll go ahead and pick that one. The author's central argument suggests that the primary reason people initially do not recognize art that eventually becomes famous as being good is that, and I give you a hint over here. Once again, we are looking for central argument. We are looking for some central argument stuff. And one habit to get, a good habit to get into is kind of framing your answer before you start looking at those answer choices. We'll talk about that a little bit more next class, about framing. But what really stuck out to me is unfamiliar. And where I'm getting that word unfamiliar is that I got it from this first paragraph. Leaves of Grass, famous poet. People like to believe they can recognize excellence when they see it, but they cannot unless it's familiar. So one of the reasons that they weren't recognizing Walt Whitman as amazing is because Walt Whitman was unfamiliar to them. And they went ahead and they gave a whole ton of reasons why Walt Whitman was unfamiliar throughout the rest of this passage. But the main idea that I'm looking for, I think the reason why people didn't recognize Walt Whitman as amazing really comes down to this idea of being unfamiliar. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look for that in the answer choices. Academia is several decades behind the development of culture. I'm not seeing much of that. I suppose someone gave me this really good argument justifying this, I think on Monday or something like that. At least I thought it was pretty decent. It seemed logical to me. But I do think this is definitely a stretch. Talking about why academia liked it several decades after it was culturally popular. I think that's definitely quite a bit of a stretch. Art is meant for the collective good and is less appealing when overly individualistic. Well, he did say something about overly individualistic. That's this bit at the very end over here about being too individualistic. I don't think that it's exactly the central argument, because again, it was just in this one paragraph right here. It's a pretty small paragraph too, where he's talking about being individualistic. And so we'll go ahead and we'll leave that one there just because he did mention individualistic. I'm not sure if it's the central argument, but we'll leave it there for now. I don't want to rule things out too fast. Leaves of Grass was poorly written. That's a no. That's a no pretty quickly, actually. Because it does seem overall that this author is pretty positive toward Walt Whitman in general. So I do want to take out something that says it's poorly written. Someone just said, I think it was it Vanessa who said that D is the right answer? D is definitely the right answer. People are less likely to appreciate art that is less familiar. Yeah, so that's coming back to our thing of unfamiliarity. That's coming back to what we said up here in the first paragraph. People can't recognize excellence unless it's in a familiar form. That's a great one. Good job, Vanessa. So that's definitely the right answer. And now we have, suppose a new artist emerged whose work was loved by some critics and hated by others. Which potential explanation for the different attitudes about this artist is the author most likely to agree with? The critics who praised this idea, or this new artist, excuse me. And so this is, once again, a hypothetical sort of thing. I do think on these questions that are kind of vague, these answer choices are a little bit confusing. So we do want to kind of frame or have a picture of what we're looking for. before we look at the answer choices. So once again, there's this new artist. Some people like him, some people don't like him. And this is kind of referring me back to this idea of unfamiliarity, because that seems to be the author's main point. Maybe these people were familiar with some work that was similar to him, and maybe these people were not so familiar. That's just kind of my theory as we're going on about, we think it's something about unfamiliarity. Some people were familiar, some people were unfamiliar. Let's go ahead and take a look at those things in the answer choices. The first one is being open-minded. And I guess I can kind of see the connection between open-minded and familiar if I thought about it hard enough. It is a bit of a stretch though. He doesn't really reference being open-minded in the article itself. I guess if we thought about it for long enough, we might be able to make that connection, but it is a bit of a stretch. Are more aware of artists like Whitman who were initially rejected? This is a pretty commonly picked trap answer. I'll go ahead and tell y'all. It is a trap answer, it's not the right answer. And the reason for that is because when we're thinking about this new situation, the reason why some people might like this kind of situation or this artist is because they're familiar with this artist's work. Being familiar with Walt Whitman's work wouldn't necessarily correspond to being familiar with this new guy's work. Does that make some sense?
Yep.
Okay. If that makes sense to you, I like that. We are not talking about being familiar with Whitman right here. We're talking about being familiar with this brand new person. So we'll go ahead and take that out. Has been exposed to work similar to the new artist's work. Now there's something I can connect pretty solidly to my idea of familiarity. They are exposed to work that is familiar to or similar to this new artist's work. So that way when they read this guy's new work, they're pretty familiar with it. I like this answer. I'll go ahead and read D. Are less analytical and intellectual? That's kind of a weird one. I'm not a big fan of that one. I don't think he really mentioned being analytical or being intellectual in this passage. So I'm going to go ahead and pick C. C is definitely the right answer. Oops, that's not what I wanted. I want to highlight that. And here's another question. This is going to be one of our negative frame questions, which we'll dive more into next class. But basically, we're saying which of the following assertions is not consistent with ideas in the passage? Not consistent, okay? So we're saying, what is the opposite of what the author's saying is basically what I'm looking for. Which of these is the opposite or is not consistent with what the author's saying? And so let's go ahead and we'll keep that in mind. I'll go ahead and take this out just because I don't want to spoil anything for y'all. Down here, answer choice A, Leaves of Grass eventually became a highly regarded book of poems. Now that seems to be pretty consistent with what the author's saying. I think the author would agree with this statement. I think in the first paragraph here, it is quite simple for university professors and literary critics to praise Whitman and his book today. So it seems like most people today are kind of liking Whitman. They're fans of Whitman. So we'll go ahead and we will keep this. We'll take this answer out. This answer again is consistent with what the author is saying. We're looking for something that is not consistent. We'll take that out. Prose poems were uncommon when Leaves of Grass was published. This is actually a pretty commonly picked answer. It is not the right answer. I'll go ahead and tell you that. Prose poems were uncommon. Now let's go ahead and take a look. We'll look for some stuff about prose if we really want to prove this to ourselves. And our stuff for prose is right up here in the second paragraph. Right after this thing about verse form, he goes on and says something about prose passages as a reason why people were unfamiliar with Walt Whitman's work. So now, if prose is unfamiliar to these people, it's not a huge logical leap to say that prose poems were not very common at Walt Whitman's time. He was kind of one of the first people who's really doing this prose poem kind of thing. or if you don't know what prose poem means, it kind of means like a poem that tells a story, like a narrative. But it basically means the poetry itself, it kind of tells a story, or there is a storyline, like kind of like a novel, as you're following along with the story, with the poem itself. But it does seem like this idea of a prose poem, you don't really need to know what prose means to answer this question, is a little bit unfamiliar to people. I do think it takes a little bit of logical stepping to get to this answer, to rule that out immediately. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that answer choice there for now, just because when I first read this, I was a little bit unclear as to what exactly this answer choice meant. So we'll go ahead and leave that there. Whitman's poetry was less coherent than people were used to. Now, I think that is pretty consistent with the ideas in the passage. I actually wrote in my blast that people were not confused. There's this idea of confusion. Life, at least in Walt Whitman's poetry, was not very well organized. And we can actually read a little bit if we want to. Obvious confusion shown by Whitman between nature and art. Somewhere down here, it's saying the artist, or the artist not Walt Whitman, had to differentiate between nature and art, and that was coherent. But Walt Whitman himself did not do this. This is not a description of Walt Whitman right here. This is a description of more typical, I guess you'd say, more typical artists or more typical poets. So Walt Whitman was definitely not the most coherent guy. That's pretty in line with what the passage was saying. And again, we're looking for not consistent, so we'll take that out. It is a common belief that poetry should always mirror nature. Well, we're looking for something that's not consistent. And in the passage itself, it seems that the common belief, or the belief that people had before Walt Whitman, is that there should be a clear distinction, or clear differentiation, I believe is the word they might have used in there, between nature and art. So poetry should not mirror nature, because there needs to be a distinction between nature and art, or nature and poetry. So I would definitely say that this was not a common belief, at least according to what the author was saying. This was a pretty tricky question. If you missed this, don't stress out. This was a pretty hard passage to start with. And this question, question 6 and question 1 were definitely the hardest ones on this passage. One thing they like to do is they like to lead you on the passage with the hardest question, just to make you second guess yourself. So they like to lead you at the very beginning. Question 1 will generally be a pretty hard question, just because they like to kind of make you second guess yourself. Maybe you really like poetry and you read this whole passage and you feel like you understood it pretty well, and now you ran into the first question, and all of a sudden you don't know how to answer the first question. You're kind of second guessing yourself, and now you think, oh, I didn't understand what was going on because this is such a hard question. This is a very common trap. They will try and do this to you all the time on the MCAT. They will try and hit you with a really hard question so you second guess yourself. Don't fall for it. The first question is usually the hardest one. So don't think just because you're having a tough time with the first question that you don't know what's going on in the passage. As long as you caught the main idea of the passage, maybe something about the author's opinion, maybe the first and last sentence from each paragraph, you have a pretty solid idea of what's going on in this passage. Don't get too concerned right there. Does anyone else have any questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Feel free to chime in. Most of these go about like 2 hours. I think, I don't know, maybe I talked fast this time. But we're a little under our time, under 2 hours. So if you guys have any comments, concerns, you can feel free to ask me. If you guys are interested in individual one-on-one tutoring, please email me. You can email me anytime. I'll get you set up for that. Other than that, that's pretty much most of what I had today. So if you want to head out, if you want to call it a night, feel free. It was a great session. I think we really talked a lot about using our BLAST technique on more complicated passages. And we really proved that it still works on more complex passages. That was my main goal for today. We did talk a little bit about trap answers, which again, I wanted to touch on. So if you guys want to head out, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, just about one of the questions from the first passage.
Yeah.
What question was it? It was question 2 and 6. I think that like these questions, and I don't know if this is just a bad habit from like just like past exams that I've taken, like the GRE and stuff like that. For question 2, I oftentimes would do like the process of elimination based off of like the verb at the beginning of the options. So like if it's asking about the key idea in the passage, I would oftentimes like go like reinvigorated. He never talks about that. It's more of like a negative sort of passage in terms of like colonialism in Papua versus like establishing something or conquering something and asserting something. Is that not a good way? It just made me think about like when you were talking to us about the strategies of like the negative framing versus the positive framing in question 3 for the supposed question. I just either want to like untrain my brain to focus on those things rather
I think
than
if you
like,
just focus on the one word, you could kind of trick yourself a little bit.
yeah.
I'm hesitant to do that because sometimes they'll hit you with something weird. Sometimes they'll say, I do understand that strategy. I know that is pretty commonly taught on the GRE. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think on the MCAT, the questions tend to be a little bit more complicated and the answer choices tend to be a little bit more convoluted. So sometimes maybe they'll hit you with this word reinvigorated over here, and then they'll kind of say something else over here. I'm not thinking of a good example right now, but that kind of saves the answer. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, for sure. Because I noticed that was like a lot of the time, like even for question 1, how D was the trap answer, like that was one of them that I was like looking at. And I noticed that I was focusing a lot more on like the verbs that the answers started with, like revisits, captures, explores. And then even for question 6, when it asked like what best describes the main goal, like I then just focused more on like to catalog, to demonstrate, to protest, or to show. And then use that as like process of elimination. But like it wasn't until like I was down to 2 answers that I would read the rest of the question. And then I was like, oh shit, like never mind, that was a trap answer. Until I got there.
I think there's a definite chance that can bite you on the back end. I'm trying to think, there might be some question types that you might be able to apply that to. I haven't thought too much about that strategy. I'll go ahead and tell you on these hypothetical ones, do not do that. Do not do that on the hypotheticals because they will give you the strangest answer choices sometimes. And if you're just looking at the first word, you're probably going to get a little confused.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I noticed with the MCAT questions, like for this section specifically, it's just been like really descriptive answer choices. Whereas like the jury, it's just like you can sort of figure it out as you go kind of thing.
Right, definitely. They do try and do that. They try and like trick people who rely on process of elimination a little too much, and that they'll give you a lot of answer choices that some of them just don't make sense and you're really unsure whether it's right or wrong. So it's hard to take out. But we can definitely talk about some other strategies. I think there are certain ways to apply that technique to certain question types on the MCAT, but I don't think it's applicable to every question type in no way.
Yeah, the BLAST method is really awesome though. So thanks for teaching us that.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope I answered your question. Did I answer your question well?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Perfect. If you want to talk a little bit more about that method, you can sign up for a one-on-one session. We can discuss that a little bit more. Some better methods to answer or approach answer choices. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yash, I have a question.
Mhm.
It's like, see in this passage and the second passage is more like what I'm going to ask you. Like, some history passages are like, passages about political sciences and stuff like that. There's too many, author doesn't talk about a consistent idea. He has like so many points within a passage also. There's like, this person is saying something and another person said something else. And like, something else happened after this war or something like, it's too many changes. In such cases, do you still is it better to just stick to first line, last line, first line, last line then?
In most cases, yes. In most cases, understanding every single perspective in the passage, unless it very directly has to do with the main idea of the article. In most cases, reading every single one of those people's opinions is going to set you back. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Let's go up to this first question, this first passage, and I'm kind of getting from here that the main idea is something about this Brooke the crocodile, this Taripi tribe, maybe something about Australian colonial whatever. If there's a bunch of different perspectives in here that are giving me different perspectives on something that doesn't relate to Australian colonial rule, I would skip them. If they're giving me perspectives on something about Australian colonial rule, you might want to look at them. And that is actually a very tricky passage type in which they give you multiple people's perspective on whatever. It happens a lot on psychology, social sciences, things like that, where they have like different theories or different maybe philosophers or psychologists or whatever who think about this. Most of the time on my first read through the paragraph, I try not to focus on those things. Sometimes the question will specifically reference you back to one of their opinions, and then I might read about their opinion, but I try to avoid it.
Okay. I was going through this political, it was more about French Revolution and how Spain and Portuguese opposed them, and like, they got battered later on.
Mm-hmm.
But like, there's like Portuguese opinion and then how French worked about it, and then Spanish people came in between. There's English in there. So, but the questions came about all these different perspectives. So I was like,
Yeah, that is so generally speaking, in those types of passages, the perspective types that are important are going to be presented in the first paragraph. So I assume the first paragraph is probably something about there's different perspectives between the French people and the Portuguese people about whatever. So on those passage types, yeah, you definitely want to practice identifying that as the main idea and keep maybe a running tally in your blast as you go through. Oh, the French thought this about this and the Portuguese thought this about this. That is one of those examples of finding a main idea in the first paragraph and then keeping track of that main idea as you keep going and seeing how they build on that main idea throughout the paragraph. But we can definitely work on those. I can give you some hard pass. I think you're signed up for a one-on-one session with me tomorrow, right?
yes.
Okay, so we'll probably work on that, and we'll work on those complex passages with multiple perspectives and all that in there.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey Yash. So, question on the very last question that we did on this message. So I like did the blast, but didn't read anything except like the first and last sentence. So I totally missed the prose one. So I picked B. So what do you recommend for that? Like, when can we rely on our blast and be like, oh yeah, I didn't encounter that in my blast. It's probably not it. And when should we go back to the passage to like double check?
Don't pick an answer that's not in your blast without going back to the passage. So I do see why you picked this. So I'm assuming you saw this wasn't in my blast. I eliminated all the other answer choices, and I guess that leaves me with this.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're in that situation, go back to the passage and try and prove it before you pick it.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, guys?
So I was wondering today you focused more on first and last sentences,
Mm-hmm.
and at least for the first meeting we had, you wanted us to pick like certain words or certain sentences that we could follow through, right?
Mm-hmm.
And today I basically didn't think of that. I don't recall picking out certain words to look out for when I was skimming, but I did skim and I still had like a minute left. But so I thought about it afterwards when I was done skimming, quote unquote. So I don't know if that's
So
a problem, like
right,
for other passages.
go ahead. What I was trying to get at today is this is what you do in the situation where you read this first paragraph and you have no idea what's the author's opinion, what is the keyword, what do I do, what am I looking for? If you can't identify a keyword, remember when we talked about it in the first class, somewhere up here, this is our backup plan. Our backup plan is to read the first and last sentence. If we can identify really clearly from the very beginning what the author's opinion is and what the keywords are and all this stuff, then yeah, let's go ahead and look for those keywords. But if we have no idea, then honestly, reading the first and last sentence will get you 90% of what you need.
Okay.
Does that make some sense?
Yes, definitely.
Cool. Okay, guys, if that's the case, I'm going to go ahead and let y'all go. If you have any other questions, I'll stick around for a little bit. I'll end the recording actually, and I'll stick around.